a group that I am a big fan of, Americans for Prosperity. I have the vice president, Akash Chougule. He, by the way, as it happens, he's made a terrific PragerU video on public unions, which in itself deserves time with Mr. Chougule. So, Akash, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on today, Dennis. How are you? Did
I pronounce your last name the way you pronounce it?
Chougule. You were very close.
No. Close at the Dennis Prager show. Close is like in horseshoes. It doesn't matter. How do you pronounce it?
Chougule.
I wasn't even close.
Dennis, I have heard much.
I'm sure you were. Oh, of that I have no doubt. But I try to compare myself to the correct, not the worst. Chougule?
Yep, you got it. There you
go. Okay, my friend, you're doing great work, and you're going on a national tour, which we'll talk about in a moment. What is the actual inflation rate?
The actual inflation rate is now 3%, which is significantly better than it was a year ago. But again, a year ago, it was at a 40-year high. 3% is still above what the government's target rate is, which is about 2%. So to put that simply, inflation is still a problem. Last month, for the first time since Biden took office, it finally grew slower than people's wages. But every month until last month, inflation, things were getting more expensive faster than people were getting raises, which means they were getting poorer every single month of this presidency until last month.
Okay, so explain the following to me. Why is my reality and the reality of anyone who enters a supermarket or restaurant way beyond 3%?
Great question. That is because specific items that we look for in the grocery store, inflation remains way higher than 3%. 3% is an overall figure. Certain foods, chicken, bread, eggs, milk, many of these household staple items, inflation is still 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10% even, depending on what you are talking about. This is a major disconnect between the White House and their charts that their economists produce and their administration officials parading around the country trying to own Bidenomics versus the reality people are facing, which helps explain why 75% of the country thinks things are headed in the wrong direction, and they blame President Biden's economic policies for it. Our national tour is about making sure people understand that, but also understand what good looks like, how we turn this around. And it's a pretty simple formula, right? It's energy abundance, controlling the reckless spending, and empowering workers instead of labor unions.
Wow. You have just described an economic utopia. It's unbelievable how basic your solution is and how far away it is.
Yes, I think we are very far away from it, and that's because this administration and just how extreme they are, how extreme the last Congress was. To put that into perspective, Dennis, you, of course, and your audience remembers the fight over Obamacare. You'll remember it was several $100 billion, $800 billion, and it was, people were going ballistic, rightfully so. This administration has spent an additional $6 trillion, with a T, $6 trillion compared to $800, $900 billion we were fighting over Obamacare. So the sheer scale of the reckless spending is really unfathomable. But I think one of the, if you can call it a benefit, is that people are finally understanding the connection between reckless government spending and making their lives harder by making things more expensive. People understand the problem. Now we want them to understand the solution. I think House Republicans have done, a fairly admirable job at some of this stuff on energy. And, that's, I think, kind of a big one where they have been constructive, but it's insufficient. And that's why we're taking it upon ourselves with 500 events across the country, a nationwide ad that's running in all 50 states called Broken Bidenomics. And people can learn more by visiting brokenbidenomics.com.
brokenbidenomics.com. Okay. When we come back, I want to ask you what might be one of the $64,000 questions What do you believe is the greatest single source of the inflation? Akash Chougule is the Vice President of Americans for Prosperity, and he has done a video for PragerU as well on the public unions. By the way, a word on public unions, that was created by John Kennedy, correct?
That is right. That problem started when Kennedy signed an executive order allowing federal employees to unionize, and it went wild at the state and local level from there. New York City at the local level, and the state of Wisconsin at the state level followed his model.
I think it is the single most damaging thing John Kennedy did as president.
I think it is arguably the single most damaging thing that has ever happened in our government as it pertains to limited government, at least in the last, I would say 60 years.
Wow. And that was all for votes, so that they would get more votes for the Democrats.
Yeah, which I think, honestly, Dennis, segues back into our conversation, which is what is Bidenomics and why is it making our lives so expensive, and what's the single biggest driver? Here's how I would answer that question you left us with. What Bidenomics is the president and his administration using our tax dollars and the mechanisms of our government to reward their friends being the environmentalist movement, the labor unions, and the public and private sector. There's zero interest in that broad-based prosperity. What has driven up costs the most, I would argue, is actually regulation. Now, this administration is obviously not new in the space of regulation. The Obama administration, other administrations had a terrible track record on this front too, but this administration has been particularly egregious, particularly aggressive, and I would argue specifically within the area of energy. Hamstringing our energy industry with more regulations and more restrictions, that impacts the food we eat, how we heat our homes, how we drive our cars, how we run our businesses, you name it. The downstream impacts of regulation on our energy industry have made every single element of our lives more difficult and more expensive. We need to not only roll back those specific regulations, Dennis, but this is what we're pushing, is completely reform the way in which our government can even create regulations and the oversight and accountability that exists over those federal agencies.
So is it regulation over business generally or specifically over the energy industry?
I would say, all of the above. Energy, of course, is a form of business. I think energy regulation has been the most harmful of regulations on our businesses because
right.
of
Okay. So when I say that the following green policy is the greatest driver of inflation, am I right or wrong?
Yes, I would say that is correct. And I think you have to specify because the number of ways in which it inhibits our energy industry and the number of things our energy industry impacts. It does not happen in a vacuum.
I'm just thinking about what you're saying. It's the calamity is so great. So when he did it, I think it was one of his first acts, if not his first, shut down what even the State Department in review after review said was completely safe, the XL pipeline from Canada. That was that ideological or payoff to the Greens?
To me, there is no difference between the two because the real motivator for this administration is politics. Now, whether that's coalition politics or it's ideology, what have you, there was no environmental benefit to doing that. And many of the decisions this administration has made in theory for the environment have had no benefit to the environment, but have cost us dearly as far as our pocketbooks in the energy industry. Think about this, Dennis. We've hamstrung the American energy industry. One, in doing so, not only have we also in many ways hamstrung green energy projects, right, through permitting and these other red tape barriers, but then this administration turns around and depletes our strategic petroleum reserves and then goes and begs Iran and Venezuela and Saudi Arabia for their oil and gas, which is not only still oil and gas, but it's oil and gas that's dirtier and more dangerous than what's produced here in our country. So we've done nothing for our environment and at the same time hamstrung our energy industry and taken money out of the pockets of hardworking families. All of what we're talking about are the connections that we want to make for the American people at the gas stations and grocery stores across the country where we're holding these events and telling them, look, here's how we turn this around. Here's what good energy policy looks like. And so that's why we're looking forward to talking to people face to face because they're certainly not being told this when they turn on the news every night.
So where should people go to find out about your tour?
Absolutely. Online at brokenbidenomics.com. They can see our 60-second ad there that's running nationwide and see where we're holding more than 500 events over the next several months. And we'd love to see you and your whole audience come out and join us, because folks, especially conservatives, Dennis, folks have got to know this stuff, at least the basics of it, so that when they talk to their friends and neighbors over the next 16 months, people are making the connection of, hey, these are the policies that made my life so expensive, and here's what's possible set our country back on the right track and create the...
What does the average liberal who relies on the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, CNN believe is the major cause of inflation?
I do not know the answer to that question. I do know the answer to that question, actually. But the polls show that they incorrectly blame it on two things. One is the war in Ukraine, and two is so-called corporate greed. Those are both obviously foolish on their face, because inflation was skyrocketing prior to the Russian invasion, and the second being that corporate greed doesn't seem to fluctuate the way that inflation fluctuates. Inflation has gone up and down. They never seem to say that corporate greed ever subsides. So there's no...
You're good. You know what? You are really, really, really good. I've interviewed thousands of people. You are one of the clearest. When they say I thought I knew the answer. I forgot the corporate greed one, but your answer is perfect. Corporate greed is permanent, so it can't explain current inflation.
Right.
When they say it's the war in Ukraine, what are they saying? We weren't buying Russian oil.
Yep, that's right. I mean, and again, Ukraine is a major producer of wheat, but guess what? So is the United States. There's a number of things, and obviously supply chains were disrupted, and no one argues. Obviously, the war in Ukraine did not help the cost of living in this country, but to pretend that it's the major driver of our inflation crisis when the government has spent $6 billion and thousands of regulations is simply not true.
Okay, we're going to talk again, and folks, go to Bidenomics.com.
Brokenbidenomics.com.
Sorry, thank you. Brokenbidenomics.com. All right, we'll talk again. Thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you.
There are some very clear-thinking people. Akash Chougule, Vice President of Americans for Prosperity, is one of them. Rick in Portland, Oregon. Hello.
Yeah, hello, Dennis. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, good. Hey, the reason I'm phoning is I've listened to your show for a long time, and I enjoy it. And I